have to do again? All right, I'm going to announce for people on Zoom that Jerry Singerman, one of our co-directors, has been honored by the Medieval Academy of America with the Jerome E. Singerman Prize, which will go to a second book in medieval studies. And the Shakespeare Association of America has honored him by establishing the SAA First Book Prize in honor of Jerry Singerman. And these, as I said to everyone in the room, but I'll say it again to you, I think these are really fitting acknowledgments of all the work Jerry has done to foster pre-modern studies, and especially early career scholars working on their first books. So I'm really thrilled that these professional organizations are recognizing that work. We'll clap again. Always worth clapping. And also Whitney, who's I think on the Zoom, Whitney Tritine, who's on the advisory board of the workshop, has just published this terrific book, Copy Paste. So I wanted to hold that up and mention the blurb I like from Catherine Hales, who calls it seriously delightful and delightfully serious in a really nice academic chiasmus. And she's right, so you should all get a copy and read it. Okay, tonight's talk, moving on. Tonight's talk, we realized only after we planned the whole semester, is actually part 2 of a reverse chronological series on scientific books in pre-modern Europe. We began with Pamela Smith on early modern how-to books. Next week, we'll have Meg Leja speaking about early medieval medical manuscripts. And so part 2 tonight is on not quite so early medieval books. And it's a tradition at the workshop that the Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text presents their work in progress to the group. And it's not exaggeration or just politeness to say that these have been some of the most exciting presentations we've had. Aylin Malcolm, who is our Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow, is a PhD candidate in the English department, specializing in medieval poetry, zoology, environmental studies, and the history of science. Aylin came to Penn following a master's at the Ohio State University and a Bachelor of Arts and Science in Environment at McGill. Along with the Bristol-Schoenberg Fellowship, Aylin has been a fellow at the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, the Price DH Lab, and the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, an indication of the breadth of their work. And they're currently finishing a dissertation on literature and zoology in relation to environmental change. So please join me in welcoming Aylin Malcolm to talk about, pun intended, I think, revolutionary science, movable books, and the medieval universe.
All right. So when I was preparing this talk, several people got in touch with me to say that they were excited for what seemed like such a fun topic. I felt grateful and encouraged. But as a senior grad student, I sometimes have trouble taking fun at face value. And so I wondered, well, what makes this topic seem fun? I think that one of the reasons that we think of movable books as amusing is that there's a strong association between mobile components and modern children's books. These devices are often used in educational texts. So for instance, here's a book that I owned as a child, in which you can turn wheels on every page to see images of animals advancing through their life cycles. My own copy is now battered and held together with Scotch tape, a point to which I will return toward the end of this talk. And there's a seemingly endless array of anatomical volumes that reveal the contents of the human body via flaps and pop-ups. But this link with children's books emerged primarily in the 18th century, alongside a broader surge in children's book publishing. In the Middle Ages, movable parts often appeared in university textbooks, and over the centuries, they increasingly contributed to the spread of knowledge beyond universities. In Peter Apian's 16th century Cosmographia, an all-inclusive introduction to astronomy, geography, and navigation, the reader encountered devices that Margaret Gaida identifies as tools for an emerging group of mathematical amateurs. This volvelle, or rotating disk, allows you to roughly calculate the position of any place on Earth, the time, and the day and time when a certain planet will pass overhead. In the same period, the printer Georg Hartmann took paper instruments a step further by creating over 70 sets that were not actually intended for use in any particular book. As Suzanne Carr-Schmidt explains in her book, Interactive and Sculptural Printmaking in the Renaissance, Hartmann actually created a market for these inexpensive paper instruments. We might also compare children's books today to early modern anatomical flat books and fugitive sheets. Though they were aimed at a more mature audience, these 17th century examples offered the same promise of allowing readers to peel back the layers and expose the inner workings of the human body. So, taking a long view of their history, movable books spread outward from the university and then downward from adults to children, becoming more accessible and more affordable, but often retaining a pedagogical purpose. The point I'm trying to make here isn't that movable books aren't fun, but that enjoyable objects can also be educational and even scholarly. And I'm going to keep returning to this question of what we can learn from early science. And this could be one of those lessons, that there's room for joy and pleasure in pedagogy at all levels. At the same time, I want to move beyond appreciating these tools into theorizing them and their impact on reading practices. So I'll begin today's talk by giving a rapid and selective overview of movable books in early Europe. There's been a fair amount of great scholarship on print books, so I will focus on the comparatively under-researched examples in late medieval manuscripts, but I'll occasionally gesture to their print descendants. I'll then delve more into astronomical volvelles and some of the purposes that they served as pedagogical aids or as stand-ins for expensive instruments. Finally, I'll move toward what I'm calling an ecological reading of these volvelles. And here I'm using the term ecology in both an expansive colloquial sense and a specific biological one. In part, I want to consider how these devices emerged from and contributed to larger social and natural networks. But I'm also interested in highlighting the natural materials from which they were constructed, materials that are often discernible in the completed book. And so to conclude, I consider another lesson that early books might be able to provide by encouraging us to attend to the materials underlying modern media, even when digital environments obscure their existence. So let's begin in the 13th century, because that's when a lot of these forms emerge in Europe. Perhaps the best known movable components are the flap, usually a piece of parchment or paper that is added onto a page, and its cousin, the fold out, or a large page that's folded up to fit within a codex. Foldouts are often simply a practical way to fit in more information or display a large illustration. They were common in small formats like these girdle books, which could theoretically be worn on a belt. That said, I think that foldouts can serve rhetorical purposes as well. They might communicate the importance or magnitude of the things depicted, and the reader may feel that they are entering in on a secret by discovering something not immediately apparent from the outside of the book. This sense of discovering a secret or an additional layer of interpretation is certainly possible with flaps as well, as we see in the remarkable autographed manuscript of the Chronica Maiora by the monk Matthew Paris. Now housed in 3 parts at Corpus Christi, Cambridge, and the British Library, this indispensable work of universal history begins with what Daniel Connolly identifies as a combination of an extensive map and an imagined pilgrimage. On one early folio, Matthew uses 2 flaps to add Sicily and Rome to his drawing of Italy. So, the reader first encounters the page and the country as a uniform entity, but can then enter more deeply into the subject by literally unpacking the text. The small flap charmingly mirrors Sicily's actual geography, separating it from mainland Italy on the rest of the page. And its verso is more narrative than representational, describing Mount Etna in apocalyptic terms. The large flap does narrative and geographic work on both sides, with the front offering space for the story of the founding of Rome, while the reverse introduces the Caspian Mountains alongside the apocalyptic legend of Gog and Magog, here unfortunately highly anti-Semitic. As Connolly notes, these flaps layer time over space or history over geography. Objects like the Matthew Paris map are precedents for the ingenious scientific flaps and foldouts of later centuries, such as John Day's 16th century edition of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which allows readers to construct solids in 3 dimensions. But in the Middle Ages, the reigning monarch of movable books was the volvelle, which might be used for purposes both technical and mystical. The 13th century philosopher Ramon Llull is often credited with the first use of the volvelle in Europe, although many scholars trace their history back to Islamic Golden Age scholars, including al-Biruni. Yui was an interesting figure who developed an unusual brand of mystical logic based on a symbolic alphabet. So essentially, every letter in these volvelles stands for a different set of terms and ideas, and the wheels allow these terms to be combined in new ways to form propositions and answer questions posed by the user. Returning to Matthew Paris, the Chronica Maior also included a volvelle, a movable version of the charts used to determine the dates of liturgical feasts. It adapts the static circular charts typically used by monks at this time, but improves on them with respect to legibility, in that the reader does not have to turn the entire book around to access information on the bottom. Similarly, volvelles might assist with computus, or the complicated process of determining the date of Easter every year. This 15th century example consists of a static set of rings indicating possible dates in March and April on which Easter might fall, alongside the golden numbers to which each year was assigned. And golden numbers were used in computus. Basically, they're a shorthand way of classifying years based on when their new moons occur. And at the center, a human figure points to two sets of dates and their corresponding golden numbers. Volvelles could also be used to measure time on a much smaller scale. Having promised that I would focus on manuscripts, I do want to mention Regiomontanus and his calendar, first published slightly posthumously by the incredible Erhard Ratdolt in 1476. Ratdolt's early editions included multicolored diagrams and a volvelle depicting lunar motion. And I do want to stress that this is really early printing, about 20 years after the Gutenberg Bible. Regiomontanus also built a portable sundial that is often represented in editions of this text, and that includes a brachiolum, or a pointer made of brass. There are also some manuscript copies of these editions, and in fact, we have a German copy of the calendar at Penn that is now missing its pointer. Sort of in the spirit of Yui's wheel, volvelles could also be tools for prognostication and divination practices like geomancy. These, broadly stated, involved using the wheel, or in some cases a gear, to generate a number that could then be looked up in the text or a table. This is still a popular way for wheels to be used, whether in games or in interactive street art, like this large volvelle at the corner of South and Juniper in Philadelphia. And finally, volvelles and other moving parts could be used in cryptography, as in this Penn book of codes and games, which was probably copied in the late 16th century. We might still use wheels and rings to encode and decode messages, so this might be familiar. But I mentioned these later devices because a lot of scholarship on early modern movable books has focused on their roles in democratizing knowledge. It's true that some creators took specialized medieval tools and adapted or simplified them to reach a wider audience. But these prognostic and cryptographic devices they're almost working in the opposite direction, catering to an emerging preoccupation with secrets via forms that were associated with obscure and arcane knowledge. And that's probably a good place to end this overview by emphasizing that movable books serve both practical and rhetorical functions linked to their particular historical context. So now I'll introduce two types of volvelles that we might consider astronomical. The first uses the positions of celestial bodies to allow users to measure the passage of time on Earth. And the second encourages readers to think about spatial relations beyond Earth. So let's begin with what are often called lunar volvelles, or devices that rotate to show the phases of the moon. These could be very basic, as in this example from the Bodleian. As this wheel moves around, a circular window exposes painted colors beneath it that mirror the moon's transformations over a month. But generally, lunar volvelles were more like simplified astrolabes, often consisting of 3 or more overlaid dials. Essentially, these were calendars that could be used for many different purposes, including converting between lunar and solar time, determining the length of a particular day, and, as we will see, identifying the best time to perform a medical procedure. We might actually compare them to analog clocks, in that both depict time as a cycle that can be divided up and interpreted. I'm going to take a few minutes to explain how they work, mostly so that we can appreciate how sophisticated these objects were. So the outermost circle here which is drawn directly onto the page, provides the cardinal and ordinal directions as well as the hours of the day. Next, we have a series of circles on a movable disk that depict the year subdivided into months, days, and zodiac signs. And then above this is a disk representing the position of the sun. So you would move the pointer of the solar disk to align with the appropriate day of the year on the lower disk. And then finally, the uppermost disk corresponds to the moon. The sun disk is divided into 28.5 segments representing a lunar month. So one would place the moon pointer over the number, indicating how many days it has been since the last new moon. If we look at volvelles where the top disk has fallen off, you can actually see that the solar disk is often painted like a heart. And this means that as the hole in the top disk moves over this heart, the user perceives a rough image of the lunar phases. So for a simple example, let's say that we want to know where the sun and moon are located today. And I've used Richard Weimark's lunar volvelle simulator to show you this. His astrolabe project is a great starting point if you'd like to learn more. So first, we need to set the sun pointer to the corresponding day of the year, the 14th day of February. The last new moon was conveniently on February 1st, so we then move the moon pointer so that it indicates 13 on the solar disk, 13 days since the new moon. And we see that the moon is waxing gibbous, so it's sort of almost completely full, and located in Leo, making February 14th a sensitive day for the heart, but a bad day for surgery. And of course, I mean that quite seriously, because premodern medicine presupposed a close relationship between the macrocosmic universe and the microcosm of the human body. I've been calling them astronomical, but lunar volvelles often actually occur in medical texts alongside standard images like the zodiac man. And this basic diagram enabled readers to quickly determine the parts of the body ruled by each sign. So for instance, Leo governs the spine, the heart, and the upper back. But while the zodiac man's message can be absorbed almost immediately, it's pretty straightforward. You just run through the signs from top to bottom. The lunar volvelle could be endlessly reused to produce new knowledge as a practical instrument enabling users to plan various aspects of their lives. There are other examples of instrument-type devices in astronomical books, and later manuscript volvelles often became even more complex, like this late 16th century paper volvelle and astrolabe set by Thomas Hood. If we zoom in on the volvelle and rotate it so that we can read the information for Leo, you can sort of see that it's motivated by the same desire to manage the human body based on celestial activity. For instance, it indicates that Leo is ruled by the sun and that it governs the heart. But volvelles also had more conceptual applications in astronomy. And here's the part where they actually start to seem a little underwhelming compared to what medieval scholars could do with their minds. So the solar system is a difficult thing to imagine. Vast, complicated, moving extremely quickly. The Earth travels around the sun at around 66,000 miles an hour. But for us, it's relatively easy to find animated models of it online. Medieval astronomers had to imagine such models by developing mental images of the universe. And by a mental image, I mean an imaginary visualization that could be moved around at will. Mary Carruthers, who has probably written the most about mental images, tells us that almost every medieval diagram implies some degree of mental manipulation on the part of the student using it. But astronomy in particular required one to imagine things that could not be observed with the senses, to situate oneself outside an enormous system that couldn't be viewed from the outside. Students were therefore trained to progress from two-dimensional drawings to conceptualizations of the universe. And this process often began with a static diagram. So these images, which some of you have seen before, represent the spheres of the geocentric universe in cross-section. And so they're often called cosmic section diagrams. They're common in textbooks such as those by Johannes Sacrobosco and Robert Gross-Test, and they may have inspired later images like Copernicus's famous heliocentric diagram. But today, let's focus on a Sacrobosco manuscript dear to my heart, Penn's MS Codex 1881. So this is a static two-dimensional representation of a moving three-dimensional universe. We have Earth at the center, surrounded by the spheres of water, air, and fire. And then proceeding outward, we encounter the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the fixed stars. But now try to imagine that each concentric ring is actually an orb, bounded by two spherical surfaces. And from there, you can begin to imagine moving those orbs around. I think that the labels here imply this movement, since reading them requires us to follow the curves of the spheres. So by guiding our gaze around this diagram, the labels model how our mental images should rotate. But of course, volvelles can convey this mobility more directly. I don't actually know of many volvelle equivalents of cosmic section diagrams, and if you do, please let me know. But there are some that are at least structured similarly. For instance, this volvelle shows the same concentric orbs from the moon up to Saturn, although mainly it allows the user to determine the planetary hours, which is basically which planet rules which time of the day. The Penn Sacrobosco manuscript does offer a few other interesting uses of volvelles. The brief passage where Sacrobosco discusses the shape of the universe. In most manuscripts, this is accompanied by small drawings, which indicate that the universe must be spherical, because if it were any other shape, it would leave behind empty spaces as it rotated. You can kind of imagine that, right? Like as a sphere turns around, it leaves no empty spaces behind. And the equivalent image in 1881 occurs next to a triangular volvelle that illustrates the same point. I like to see this volvelle as a training wheel, an aid for a relatively simple mental image. So a student could begin by rotating the volvelle and then turn to the static image, trying to perform the same operation mentally, and move back and forth until this was easy. 1881 also contains a great example of a volvelle showing the epicyclic motion of the planet. But first, what do I mean by epicycle? So we refer to the pre-Copernican system as geocentric astronomy, but actually planets don't orbit the Earth in this model. In the classic Ptolemaic system, planets move around in a small circle or epicycle. The center of the epicycle moves around a larger circle called the deferent, and the center of the deferent is called the eccentric, which is a little bit displaced from Earth. Among other things, this model was used to explain apparent retrograde motion, which is when planets appear to move backward across the sky. And both Mercury and Venus were retrograde a few weeks ago. Sacrobosco's model is similar enough that we can fairly easily shift to reading this volvelle, which contains many of the same components. When the planet enters the inner portion of its epicycle, that's when it will appear retrograde to us. So the diagram is labeled retrograde at that point. Without getting into the details of different models, I'll just note that volvelles depicting epicycles appear in other manuscripts as well. Here's one in a 16th century set of illustrations to Georg von Feuerbach's Theoricae Novae Planetarum, which I think we might also have on the table. And finally, volvelles could be used to illustrate unusual cosmic phenomena, such as the conditions required for an eclipse. This is a popular subject for illustrations because in the geocentric model, it initially seems that an eclipse would happen at every full moon. Like looking at this image, we might ask, why doesn't the Earth block out the moon every month? Well, as in modern astronomy, the answer emerges when we think in 3 dimensions. The sphere of the moon is tilted relative to that of the sun, so eclipses only occur at 2 nodes where these orbs intersect. It's a similar situation for solar eclipses, except that the moon is between the Earth and the sun. Certain illustrators use volvelles in inventive efforts to represent eclipses in 2 dimensions. The one present in 1881 is clever, but requires a little bit of interpretation. So here we see the Earth, Sun, and Moon. The moon travels along its deferent, this circle, and for simplicity's sake, we can say that the sun moves around the other circle. These circles intersect at 2 points that Sacrobosco for some reason calls the head and tail of the dragon, and an eclipse only happens when the full moon is at one of these intersections between the sun's path and the moon's. The important takeaway is that readers are being asked to visualize 2 intersecting circles that are not in the same plane. So if you remember, it looks like this. So as appealing as this volvelle is, it's only a simplification, a flattened version of the image that a scholar might hold in their mind. All right, on to the what if portion of the evening. So as I hope I've demonstrated, astronomical volvelles reveal the sophistication of medieval learning and the integrated nature of the pre-modern universe. But given the dramatic changes in astronomy that have rendered their practical uses obsolete, what else can we learn from these objects? I want to start to consider this question, and then maybe we can develop other ideas together. One perhaps obvious answer has to do with the educational value of nonlinear reading and participatory engagement with novel concepts. It's generally a mistake to assume that pre-modern reading was ever linear, given the highly glossed codices common in universities. And all diagrams tend to thwart attempts to read a text through from beginning to end. But movable books really invite readers to direct their own learning, often requiring them to develop new skills or approach concepts from a different angle. They're experiential and tactile, literally hands-on. And this leads me to another point. Even as these instruments might promote advanced mental images of the universe, they also draw our attention to the physical state of the text itself. Often, movable components visibly diverge from the style or writing surface used in the rest of the book. The 1881 volvelles are made of a durable parchment, even though the rest of the manuscript is paper, and therefore they might evoke all of the usual questions that scholars tend to raise about parchment. Do visible veins or traces of hair, for instance, make us think of the animal from which the device was derived? Volvelles might also be made of a finer parchment than the surface on which they were mounted, or they might be flesh-side parchment mounted on hair side. And often they use materials that would not be employed much in a codex apart from its binding, like strings or pieces of wood. As we've seen, moving parts might even be embedded in a book's covers. Personally, I'm not convinced that readers would have paid much attention to the materiality of their textbooks on a regular basis. I don't know that a typical student would be constantly noting the follicles and thinking about goats, because those consistent aspects of the manuscript swiftly become part of the background. But because volvelles stand out, they operate a bit like holes or scars in renewing our sense of this materiality. And so I think that astronomical volvelles had the ability to direct readers' imagination toward both celestial and earthly matters. They enabled readers to envision the universe as a whole, including large-scale processes that they could never personally witness. And they might also call attention to the particular plants and animals from which they were made. This ability to shift between scales between the local and the global, or beyond the global, is a key aspect of modern ecological theory. Astronomy often has an ecological aspect, whether one is a 15th century physician or a 20th century astronaut, because contemplating the stars involves locating ourselves in larger systems, and often results in an awareness of our precarious position. But I think that these moving devices encourage us to locate our books and other media within that system as well. In fact, one further point to make about volvelles is their fragility. As Laurel Braswell-Means puts it, volvelles were designed to be vulnerable. There are many otherwise well-preserved codices that have lost most of their volvelles. In fact, we should consider the examples that I've shown to be exceptions. And so these devices can heighten our awareness of a fundamental problem in historical studies, the small number of surviving sources. These objects expose the limitations of the archive, composed as it is of texts that happen to not burn in a fire, that weren't torn apart for kindling or for binding scraps. There's also, I think, something poetic about the fact that human hands have degraded these representations of the world, given the anthropogenic changes that have occurred in the real world. And I don't mean to suggest that pre-modern readers anticipated that human actions could change the course of nature, but the damage sustained by volvelles at human hands might be a symbol for us, a sign of the fragility of the systems that we inhabit. I know I'm getting a little spacey, but here's something else that I've learned from working on volvelles. It's tempting to compare pre-modern volvelles and other movable books to apps. I've participated in efforts to build apps that mimic how these books would have worked. It's quite a popular thing. We can align such projects with a larger trend in social media, wherein specialists, like Nick Herman, try to convey the experience of touching an old book. As Joanna Green observes, when curators' hands appear in images and videos of manuscripts, They serve as haptic intermediaries, inviting readers to reenact these gestures using their touchscreens and trackpads. Touching becomes a large-scale shared phenomenon rather than an individual one. A brilliant point. But what if we turned it around? What if, in addition to connecting to pre-modern books through our screens, we allowed those books to alert us to the materiality of digital media as well? When I lay my hands over a digital facsimile, I often experience not a mental image, but a mental texture. I imagine the feeling of parchment, and sometimes this experience makes me think as well about the material infrastructures that make digital archives possible. The manuscripts on our tables today are made up of earthly materials, but so are the computers and data centers that have enabled us to run this series virtually. I don't know how generalizable this experience is, but the app-volvelle comparison does illustrate how older text technologies tend to be absorbed by newer ones, persisting in forms that we might otherwise consider modern. Time, after all, is a flat circle. Thank you. That's all for me, so excited to talk about this.
Thank you, Aylin. That was great. I'm going to moderate here. Can people on Zoom here? So then, John, you could put it like. All right.
I love that question. Thank you. This reminds me a little bit of, I know that someone else is working on this, but is there ever a suspicion of touch in the philosophy that you're describing, or is there sort of a suspicion of touching the sculpture too? Yeah, I think that maybe speaks to this sort of general pattern where things things from the past start to be viewed as things that are a little bit immature, things that are for children, which I do think has happened with movable books a little bit. But yeah, I'd love to get some sources from you later about yeah, that particular philosophical branch. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer about the cameras. If anyone does, jump in. I mean, I guess that would be better than just having a circular diagram, because it would sort of, it would be more effective rhetorically. Yeah, but I wonder if that sort of helps me to think about your previous point. And I love the idea of a prosthesis, which is that they're not making knowledge completely accessible. You know, it's sort of just, there's a different way of thinking about this complicated concept, but you're going to have to learn this new way of engaging with it in order to use this instrument too. You know, like the eclipse volvelle, it's not a three-dimensional model. It's just sort of, maybe this will work a little bit better for you. And so I almost wonder, I mean, we did see the Matthew Paris volvelle, but a lot of them are not simply replicating something that could be in a static diagram and making it more exciting and more interesting. They're always sort of presenting new information, as far as I know. I mean, of course, if people know know more, please jump in from the chat. Should we go to the? Mm-hmm.
When that happens, it becomes always put out there any dust jacket that, you know, when these are ways, moments where the main sort of have to be used in a way that is ordinary. So that the physicality actually so it's just imagine that these students we're not, you know, super studious all the time, but probably the students can sit around and enjoy it, you know. And I just wonder, I'm reading, I keep thinking there must be some evidence of that, like something in like romance, or something, like it would be perfect for using the fire coming out of the ground. But we don't, are these really totally confined to students or the scholarly student research, or are there any, maybe not volvelles, but examples in manuscripts of people trying to, somehow write or like,
Yeah, it's a sort of a fine line, I guess. I think, obviously in print books, this becomes more common. We were talking about George Withers' collection of emblems before the talk got started. I think 423, the code manuscript that we have here, is sort of walking that line between serious and playful. And it's also walking the line between medieval and early modern. And I don't know that it's really, those are really serious objects. What is really the point of writing in code, if not to kind of be joyful and to share knowledge in this unusual way. But I don't know of a lot of like really literary texts that have these devices in them. And I think, as usual, you have to think about survival and what we still have. Yeah, I definitely think, that's quite variable with whether diagrams are labeled or not in general. I would hesitate to sort of say static diagrams are definitely more textual, although that is my instinct. I can definitely say that it's strained my abilities as a literary person, and I've really had to rely a lot on art historians and that kind of scholarship to understand these a little bit better. I think in some cases, of course, they are working with a text, like I didn't go too far into the UE volvelles, but that sort of format where you spin the wheel in order to generate text or to find something that you can then look up in a text. It seems a bit gimmicky to us, but that sort of generating new text from this visual interactive thing. So there's kind of a close relationship there. Sorry, am I not loud enough? Oh, the mask thing is really hard. Yeah, sorry, everyone.
Jim Vogel had a question.
Hello?
Okay.
Oh, sorry, of course, yeah.
I'm just colder.
Jim, could you say that what you were planning on saying?
Oh, so I was very interested in this because when I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, they asked me to come, because I'm a historian of 16th, 17th century astronomy, to interpret a volvelle for them from Appion's Cosmographia, And when I went to look at it, what struck me was that in the Johns Hopkins copy, on the thread on the volvelle, there's a piece of lead smashed flat so that it'll fit in the book, about the size of a nickel. And it's a plumb bob. You're supposed to hold the book up, use the plumb bob to align the thing, and then it's a vertical sundial. And you can figure out what time it is. There's also a little thing on the sight you fold out to cast a shadow down the sight. So the whole thing is an actual working astronomical instrument. And I was fascinated, but as I wrote it up for them, they were going to do an exhibit on woodcuts. And then when I went to see the exhibit, it said a volvelle. So at any rate, it's materially speaking, I think it's a very interesting artifact. I've never seen another set of volvelles, and I've seen many, that actually had a plumb bob. And I was super interested to see the examples you had of sundials that had gnomons, because I've never seen that. But anyway, I just wanted to mention this as a materiality thing. It's to me super interesting.
Yeah, the question I have, I mean, that is really a fascinating object, and I would love to know if there are other things like that with the plumb bob. But I guess my question is, why does that have to be a book? You know, why make it a book? Why not just make it a single sheet? And I suppose there might be single sheets that we just don't know about, but it's interesting, this, you know, adding different materials that don't even really fit very well in the codex form, these sort of metallic levers that just kind of make the book unwieldy. Like, what's it doing there?
I think it's the author. I think it's Appian trying to talk, trying to put sort of more content in the book, in the terms of, you know, you can do these volvelles that show you where the horizon is, or what, you know, what month this thing will occur. But that particular one is like, you can use this book to tell you what time it is. And that was super interesting to me. And I think if you have a chance, you should look at that copy down at Hopkins.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Amazing material, and so much of it. You'll have to my kind of question or thought was about thinking about the sort of reversal of this idea that, you know, children and, you know, corrected that very rightly. I was thinking about sort of the role of public astronomical law, like in straw and a place where they had these cloths, they don't exist anymore, but so that were publicly visible, and the kind of discourse between the civic cloth and the actual cloth. But, you know, some of these devices are quite complex and illustrated in these phenomena. So I'm wondering about, you know, is this perhaps something that's not born of the book, but is born of the cloth, and becomes sort of, I mean, where the book is altered itself. Is there a kind of, so what is the relationship between that? And I guess we have to go to the chronology as well. So that's the first question. The other unrelated question is about sort of the natures of these volvelles. I don't know very much about it. I'm not sure if anyone looked at it about, but I mean, they're so, you know, there's a lot of sectors that is an immense publicly producing the diagram. Try the author, the specialist, and do you have any sort of material evidence on the volvelles themselves and whether the numbers that
I mean, I can answer the second question first, because the answer is I have no idea, and I've wondered this myself, and I don't know. I mean, I guess it's sort of somebody's thesis waiting to happen. Looking into movable diagrams the way that we've looked into illustrations before, the clock thing is really interesting. I wish we had Ellie here, you know, sort of to tell us a little bit about automata and how those get represented in the illuminations for one, and then also the sort of, as you're saying, the chronology there. Definitely, again, this is in like early modern books, there is this sense of, okay, we're going to take this instrument and put it into a book, which again, I think is such a weird, what instinct, where does that come from? Why do we want to put things into books? Sort of in this compendious way, but the medieval volvelles are not always based on an instrument that I know of. Sometimes they're sort of doing their own thing. Sometimes they don't even work very well. I didn't show this, but there's this bizarre English translation of Sacrobosco by Anthony Asham, which is in a manuscript at Yale. And he has tons of volvelles in this book that I don't really see the point of. They're just sort of decorative. He has an eclipse volvelle that is just a static diagram on an axle. It's just like, it's kind of cute, but I don't know that it's adding more. So I think that there's more variety and more sort of leeway for artists and designers and scribes and sometimes all of them in one person, to come up with their own visual aids. But yeah, I'd love to think more about clocks. Love clocks.
Thanks very much. Great. I have a question about what was over not good. Talking about, the calculating time is just central that every liturgy for books is related. What they're trying to do is extremely complicated to do. Calculate weeks which have no empirical reference in that sense. There is a world that makes a week a week, except that Genesis told you that you've got 7 days, and you've got time. So you've got the week, you've then got the month, which is dictated by lunar cycles, and then you've got the year. And so you've got these 3 systems, this almanac. Typically, I'm working week-late about this, about how you actually make these calculations. You have to make these calculations all the time. Every priest, obviously you can buy something to give you calculations. So I'm wondering what exactly it is that the volvelles do that's different from this. It's because they're more abstract. It does seem to be less about, calculate a feast day, which is a sort of central activity. So calculate more loosely from it. And that's what it's only sort of complicated. But any almanac is doing it. So the other final thing about the both answers is that the almanac actually in medieval research was directly reading. They tell you what you should be reading on what day. So literally it's a feast day, and the priest has to know what parts of the Bible you're reading on what day, depending on who the saint day is, or just depending on the day of the week. And so this is going to be, of course, enormous disruptions as calendars change, as you've got context between calendars. Obviously, it's going to come up in the Reformation, as you get rid of so it's a totally different reading practice as you actually read through the Bible. I'm just wondering what it is that volvelles add to what anyone would use practically speaking without a volvelle.
I love that what's sort of emerging for me here is that we need a piece on useless volvelles. Now that we've sort of appreciated, okay, they're complicated, people were smart, as smart as we are. All of these volvelles that aren't doing a lot of important work, like the computer volvelle that I showed. Okay, there's a little person that's sort of pointing to things, but that doesn't help you understand what a golden number is, or how to apply it, or how to do any of these complicated calculations that absorbed people every single year to figure out when Easter was going to be. Yeah, I think I'm not really sure what that particular example is doing, other than, I don't know, making it a little bit more fun, which is sort of, it's too easy of an answer, The Paris chart, Matthew Paris chart, that chart already exists. He makes it easier to read. Okay, but that's not really maximizing the potential of the device. It's kind of just an aesthetic choice, So after today, I'm going to round up all of the worst volvelles and figure that out.
Isn't that, it's the one where, you know, the person's finger is pointing on the foot. And that seems like it's about like the ingenuity. It feels to me like the code breaking one, the code creating one. Because when you turn it, you already have to know how to do computing essentially in order to do the whole out. But what's cool about it is that finger and the foot at the same time are pointing to the correct thing always, doesn't matter, right? Turn it so that it works out. So that one, it does feel like because you can't use it without the knowledge already that you are trying to gain from it. It feels like one that is more for, but like that feels like almost a literary all done, right? It's not really imparting you about it. It's showing you in a genius, really exciting way. Feels, right? But that does feel like what's happening in social, but also in modern, like, right? It always works. That's just, no matter which way you turn it. How did they get that? And it's always be pointing to the right thing. Together.
About if you feel that if you do that stable and you the beginning of the you know, when you didn't you think about you know the and sort of going back to that that's a long way to say, yes, you can.
So you kind of, as you probably are aware, this is like a huge sort of raging debate among medievalists who are sort of divided between whether the digital world can democratize knowledge or whether it's never the same as touching the real manuscript. You know, the weight of the codex, the sort of sentimental, oh, I love the way that parchment smells, or I hate the way the parchment smells, or this parchment smells like it was burned once. You know, these kinds of things that don't translate well to the digital world. I think for sure there are things that can't be captured, but I like to think more about the possibilities that digitization opens, and the ways that you can annotate these diagrams, you can kind of make them into volvelles when they weren't originally, and that's really important if you want to understand how they were used, because it's so difficult to do so. But I'm also, I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about like, why do we even study these things? What's sort of the point today? And I think maybe I'm most interested in that interface between the physical and the digital, and what the process of digitization can reveal about both ways of appreciating knowledge.
Okay. While acknowledging that digital surrogates are objects of their own generative processes and functions, I wonder about digital interactivity that, while not strictly tactile, would prompt certain types of.
Yeah, including interactions that are not possible with the manuscript, like zooming in. Really important if you want to be able to read it a lot of the time. I don't read real manuscripts anymore. I just read pictures. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an inviting possibility to, as I was saying, to sort of imagine ways of making manuscripts even more interactive that might be inspired by some of these older forms. Like how maybe you can turn this into a flat book, even if it wasn't to begin with. Yeah, I mean, the failures of digitization, I don't know, I could go on for a while, but maybe I won't. Absolutely, yeah. I don't, slide rules are a little bit outside of my period and my personal experience, but that's an amazing point, and it sort of made me, like I'm sort of spinning through different objects that I might have used in my life as well, things that we don't appreciate as being maybe connected to these much older precedents. So thank you. Oh yeah, Sarah. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you, Aylin. That was such an interesting talk. And I was particularly taken because you're engaging with something that I've long been struggling with myself, which is kind of notions of play and how to take play seriously. And what can we bring to thinking through that sort of a lighthearted physical manipulation that makes something that can seem so fun, as you said, not deadly, but deeply serious. And why are these strategies so often used in education? And in my context, I was very interested in devotion. And you wouldn't know this, but one of the things that why I started thinking about play and toys seriously in terms of a devotional context is because Michael Camille, the famous medieval art historian, had the review of the 1997 exhibition on ivories, and it was just called Gothic Toys. So that's what I've dedicated my life to. But I've been thinking a lot about this, and this in a way builds on what Zach was saying about already having previous knowledge of something, but that the phenomenology of manipulating reinforces knowledge and encourages deeper engagement. So I was just wondering, I don't know, if you had any other thoughts about play and where else to go with that. And I suppose also I wanted to buttress you in pursuing that as a kind of a critical intervention, because I don't think that it is happenstance or kind of anachronistic in looking back and thinking about it.
Thank you. Gothic toys, amazing. I mean, I almost feel like I should defer to Rita here on, you know, pre-modern educational practices. Well, I mean, otherwise my sentiments are going to be largely anecdotal. You know, like I know that when I'm teaching, it helps to sort of encourage my students to get up and do something physical. But I don't know, I actually don't know much about the theories of physical movement in the later Middle Ages. I don't know if anyone else does, but yeah.
And just to jump on with that, Aylin, I don't know if it's even necessarily that we have medieval texts that would help us understand that, but maybe even reading through contemporary pedagogy, early childhood development, and it might just offer you a really interesting sort of tangential entry into taking toys and plays seriously.
Yeah, that I think is absolutely true. This ties in with a lot of sort of experiential learning theory, theories of participation in pedagogy, which, you know, we maybe think we came up with, but have a much longer lineage. So yeah, thank you so much, Sarah.
It is great to think about, you know, the cause of driving, but thinking if my mind is out of this class, you know, I can, you know, what is my role? You can be satisfied, but I mean, I think it goes back to that question that you know, what is, you know, that's the dragon fight.
Yeah, and of course there is that, but I forgot to mention, but there is that famous early modern volvelle with the dragon. Yeah, yeah, I don't know, Matthew Paris. I mean, I agree with you. I think he's just making that book for himself, really. I mean, I don't know that he's making it in order to to educate anyone else. Really, it's just sort of an art object, which is also valuable. But yeah, it's a good reminder that the same kind of device doesn't always serve the same purpose, which is maybe obvious, but I do want to make sure I'm not sort of suggesting that. Yeah.
Can I put the word volvelle term, whether we get, and whether that's an early term, whether, you know, the space or there's a nomenclature describing the whole.
Sort of keeping my brain here. I think it might go back to yours, but don't quote me on that. Does anyone else? I don't know. I'm just sort of like.
They're very difficult to find any sort of usable description, but surely there must be an inventory. Maybe people want to go water want to go try and use that right. So in first language inventory provide some way, you know, the funny moving diagrams or the curious moving diagrams. You know, there was some aspects of contemporary language. And I'm sort of wondering about this too. I mean, you say you're not reading text anymore, of course you are, but any of these have like a little lines of instruction around them?
Yeah, they do sometimes. And generally they'll be referred to as circles in the books that I've seen, which doesn't really help you. It doesn't sort of, it doesn't indicate if there's anything different about these diagrams. Yeah, I mean, the cipher manuscript that we have has pretty extensive descriptions. The Beinecke 337 manuscript has instructions for using those volvelles that, as I said, are not very useful. Yeah, it kind of comes down to the individual text, I think.
Because not to get the one that shows the three-dimensional tools that you can but the volvelle, you know, on one hand you can print all the stuff, so you can print it. On the other hand, the gap between the amount of labor and cost of the dimension without that volvelle, with that, seems like it's narrow than the gap between the cost printed book on that. In other words, if you put them in printed book, they're actually sort of more luxurious, right? Because we now do manufacture the whole thing. So we can't afford to print it. So
It's not clear that they always, I mean, I think that you, if you only expect to do that, so it's not.
you wouldn't buy a ready assembly. Where would the link like that when it's trying to make that, when you make 1,000 copies of that thing? Or is it just when you get some pages?
Yeah.
So then it is like, so then that does.
But it's interesting that there's a lot of 16th century volvelle manuscripts. So it's still as if, you know, I kind of see what you're saying. There's it doesn't make printing doesn't make volvelles and movable parts as easy as it makes certain other types of printing. Oh yeah.
But there are massive and you know, there's little sorts of, they're not actually books, but they're things that university a number. Oh, like outside, that might be put in the window. And so I think that just that exhibition, long history. I think it is it's practical, very practical. With Lavelle, particularly with, I mean, really simple, bubble not, you know, just a dial at a time. And in that sense, we're using dials as a time, whether it's, you know, on temperature, or things like that. So I think that there's some things that are very simply done by rotation, and then you can do it more complicated. And one thing I had is that, I don't know if anyone knows about this, about the other cultures that are, particularly in China, where you know, the civil service exam. Someone did a lecture about this way back. But right into the 19th century, you know, you had to do all this calendar stuff. And so one of it is extremely complicated, very sophisticated. I just wonder whether a comparative study would find out what other trends you see there. You know, Pascal and the very thing that Pascal, and I think that is a very interesting category to develop, which to some extent what's happened, you know, from my perspective anyway, is that the reorganization of the relationship to primary education, which kids are expected to learn with their hands, whereas teach university education, a lot of French material has been come up with the options about the notion of theory to what university is. And that you shouldn't be tactile, you know, you actually learn to sit still, not to move. That's part of what to learn how to do it, as opposed to the emphasis of authority, that is supposed to be authority, compared to what, you know, memory systems talk about, which might be about actually moving around the people, learning, thinking, and acting, practices might be anyway. Obviously, sitting still and other things that help music. There might have been a greater emphasis in education pedagogy itself about acting experience, as opposed to what's tending to happen with that validated primary school. And that's why children's practical issues. And they seem to have solved these questions ourselves, but I don't know how they solve these questions. You know, I was constantly buying books by dinosaurs come out of the, they're spectacular. And yet they're relatively cheap, so that they do some other ways to do. So the comparative thing, I think, is that whether there are these sort of practice things and whether they're relegated to one thing. If I'm right about that, it's kind of decreasing, which is what you described at the very beginning, that balance of work on the university.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, it opens up a lot of questions about like, the architecture of the book, you know, how you read a book spatially. When I read a book, I think about when I'm looking for something that I know is in a book, I always know what side of the book it's on. You know, I always know that, and we don't really view that as a useful skill these days so much, but perhaps in the past, yeah, alongside all of these sort of topic things. Mhm.
But that around the transit is part of the problem. So they could be things that you can actually say what we all. When you totally standardize the thing, because it isn't a one, then it looks like, I actually would do a lot of it. You're looking at how much it is with other times. If you didn't follow the money, always comes. So it's not like a map, it's not what standardized. Well, I think we can wrap up. Quite a bit. So thank you. That was